oppressor consciousness is different. Anytime we're talking about, for Freire, anytime we're talking about oppressor consciousness, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail nearing the end of this this particular video series. Oppressor consciousness is always understood rather than this internalization of oppression, this submersion of oppression. It's directed outward, right? It's directed outward, right? It's directed outward. Rather than have oppression sort of infiltrate or filter inward, the oppressor consciousness is directed outward. And the question was, well, what is this oppressor consciousness? In the parentheses, I have the idea of keeping up with the Joneses. And if you think about the idea of keeping up with the Joneses, we all should know what that is. In case you don't, it's simple, right? I have a car. It's a fairly decent car, nothing flashy. It does what it needs to do. It gets me from work, and it takes me to the grocery store, and it brings me back home. My neighbor, Bob buys the new car, the flashy car, with all the extras. And I see that Bob has this flashy new car, and I want what Bob has. So I go out, and I buy a better car than Bob, right, to sort of one-up Bob. And then Bob one-ups me and buys a better car, and back and forth, right? It's this idea that individuals can identify themselves as individuals insofar as they have a capacity to buy. The more things that you have, the more, they have a word for it too, not political power, the more economic power that an individual has, right? The more capital, the more money an individual has, the better the likelihood and the better standing that that individual has. I can buy more than Bob, therefore I'm a better person than Bob. That's sort of the idea. So the oppressor consciousness, which I don't want to get into too much right now because I'm going to talk about this later, is that the oppressor consciousness imposes in the world objectification, right? It objectifies everything within the world. And we'll see how deep this level of objectification gets in a few minutes, right? So the imposition, I-M-P-O, the imposition of objectification throughout the world. Right. So the oppressor consciousness is this attempt to impose objectification on everything in the world. And we'll see the significance that this idea of objectification has in relationship to the maintenance of their oppressor class, right? The maintenance of their category of oppressor group, right? The group that oppresses other people. But I'll get to that a little bit later. So before I erase it, pretty simple. All we've said is that individuals only think in terms of oppression. We know that that idea is an idea of submersion. We said that the oppressed consciousness is sort of like a tinted shade of glasses that you wear on your eyes. And all this does, this oppressor consciousness, is that it filters everything that we come to understand in terms of oppression, such that everything that we see, everything that we think, everything that we do, everything that we say is then said, seen in terms of oppression. In order for us to rectify this oppressed consciousness, what we need to do is recognize, right, through the act of recognition, we need to recognize, and I say submersion, we need to transform submersion to recognition. I recognize that I have this limitation and attempt to free myself from this bondage. With respect to the oppressor consciousness doesn't have and doesn't see, it's not that it doesn't see in terms of oppression, because it does, but what it does is that it imposes objectification on others throughout the world. This objectification is not just on physical things. Time becomes objectified. Hours become objectified. Love, non-tangible, intangible things become objectified as well. And we'll see the role that objectification plays in the oppressed consciousness later in the video. Okay. Now, with respect to Freire's account, the question becomes, what is oppression specifically? And I'm just going to read it. I'm not going to write it on the board. Freire says that oppression is any instance in which A objectively exploits B or hinders self-affirmation, right? Anytime A, individual A, the oppressor, exploits or objectifies B, right, we have an act of oppression. right? So the objectification of B by A equals the dehumanization of B by A. We recognize from previous videos that this objectification, this dehumanization, is done in part because of the guilt that A feels, and we also recognize that this guilt is rationalized, right? We rationalize this guilt through a paternalism that is inherent in the oppressor population. Now that might seem like a mouthful, but if you've been watching the series up until this point, it should make sense, right? That the objectification of the oppressed population is a consequence of the oppressor's class guilt. And that guilt is rationalized by a paternalism, which eventually leads to false charity, false generosity, and so on. Okay, so the role of violence in oppression proper. So we're going to find out what this role is, right? The role of violence in oppression. Alright, so the question is, what is the role of violence? What role does violence play in oppression, in the act of oppressing a group of people? Okay, this hindrance constitutes violence, right? Oppression, the act of oppressing an individual, constitutes, by definition, according to Freire, violence. So if you can think about an oppressor as being here, right? And the oppressed person as being sort of on a lower level, this attempt to confine the individual, right? This confinement of the oppressed group is an act of violence, right? This is an act of, right? This is an act of violence. I've limited the ability, by definition, of the oppressed group, right? The oppressor is limited, by definition, the ability of the oppressed group, and in so doing, constitute this act of limiting their ability, of telling them the limits of their potential, of defining more so the limits of their potential, is an act of violence, according to Freire, right? So the hindrance, this hindrance, and the question is a hindrance to what extent? A hindrance to the realization of an individual's self-determination, right? Anytime we're talking about a hindrance with respect to Freire of the oppressed group, the question becomes what, if I could draw that thing right, the question becomes, what does this limitation represent, right? What does the limitation represent? This limitation represents a hindrance. And the question is, well, what is this limitation a hindrance of? It's a hindrance of self-determination. And then the question becomes, well, why is there a hindrance of self-determination? Because we recognize, as the oppressors, right, we recognize that if among the oppressed population, they get the idea that they can determine of their own volition the effects, the sustainability of their own lives, such that they don't require us, this act of false charity, for sustenance, then we become irrelevant, right? We need to keep the oppressed population dependent on the false charity of the oppressor in order to limit, in order to hinder their act of self-determination, right? So that self-determination is hindered within Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed by an act of violence. This act of violence constitutes the very notion of oppression that he articulates in the title of his, or suggests in the title of his book.